Good morning. I'm Sue Dibble. I'm one of the members of the Oakmont Sunday Symposium board, and I'm here today to introduce Dr. Hollis Robbins, who will be our speaker this morning. She's Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at Sonoma State University, and previously she was the chair of the Department of Humanities at the Peabody Institute of the Johns Hopkins University, as well as director for the Center of Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Robbins is an expert in the field of 19th century African American literature and co-edited with Henry Louis Gates Jr. an anthology of African American women's writing along with two other books. Her newest book, Forms of Contention, Influence, and the African American Sonnet Tradition, has come out this year. But today she's here to talk about the Hannah Croft mystery. So without further ado, Dr. Robbins, you're on.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Sue, for that introduction. And I'm really delighted to be talking to everybody this morning. I'm talking about a mystery. So the title of my talk is Solving a Literary Mystery with Letters and Genealogy. I'm interested in genealogy and I'm interested in literature, and this seemed like a really interesting talk that I hope is interesting to you as well, about how we figured out who an author was, through both textual clues and clues about, it's a woman who was a slave, and how about the people who owned her, and how we found out who she is. So, by the way, I'm speaking to you from a backdrop that is the art gallery at the Sonoma State Library. And as with all backdrops, sometimes it goes in and out, so please excuse that. So, back about 7 years, on the front page of the New York Times was this headline: Professor says he has solved a mystery over slaves novel. And the novel in question was The Bondwoman's Narrative by Hannah Crafts, a fugitive slave recently escaped from North Carolina. Now, 10 years earlier, I had opened up a copy of the New Yorker magazine, so February of 2002, and I had read that Henry Louis Gates Jr. had found a slave auction, a manuscript, a slave manuscript or a novel manuscript at an auction that was called The Bondwoman's Narrative, written by this woman, Hannah Crafts. And he bought it as obviously a scholar of African American literature, interested in the fact that this might be the first novel ever written by an African American woman, and hopefully we would be able to date this around the mid-1850s. At that point in time, the first known novel written by an African American woman was in 1859, so he's always interested in finding something earlier and finding evidence of robust literary experiences by enslaved African Americans. Anyway, he had given an interview with the New Yorker magazine when he was talking about his book that was about to come out, and there's a picture of the book there called The Bondwoman's Narrative, edited by Henry Louis Gates. And I was actually standing by the mailbox, having just taken the New Yorker out of the mailbox while I was waiting for my kids to come home on the school bus, and I started reading. And he was talking about how The Bondwoman's Narrative by Hannah Crafts accords with the usual genre of the slave narrative. It tells the story of how she's born, a slave is born, briefly happy, realizes that she's facing a life of bondage, suffers, and dreams of freedom. Some nice person teaches her to read. She realizes the importance of literacy. She watches, she waits, she describes her cruel masters and other slaveholders in awful detail, and finally she escapes, the more dramatically the better. She's reunited with friends and family and devotes her life to an anti-slavery cause. Now, if you've read any slave narratives, most importantly, Frederick Douglass's narrative of a slave from 1845, this is the standard genre. This is almost all slave narratives follow this general format. And this narrative that Henry Louis Gates had found followed this narrative, but it was also fictionalized. So it was a kind of hybrid fiction and narratives. So in this New Yorker story, Henry Louis Gates, there's a picture of him, describes the way he is trying to prove to the writer as to himself that that she clearly is a writer, a novelist, as well as a slave. And he says Hannah Crafts describes the winter in Washington with the vividness of someone who may have seen it herself. And he pulls out a quote here: "Gloom everywhere, gloom up the Potomac, where it rolls among meadows no longer green," etc. This paragraph. And I'm standing there by my mailbox. I was a graduate student in Princeton at the time, and I think to myself, that's odd. That sounds just exactly like the second paragraph of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So Hannah Crafts, gloom everywhere, gloom up the Potomac. Bleak House is fog everywhere, fog up the river where it flows among green eights and meadows, down the river where it defiles among the tears, the chipping water, and the great pollutions of the city. And the fog paragraph is a very famous paragraph from those of us who study Dickens. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, how is it this escaped slave in the 1850s would be transforming Charles Dickens that way to describe her own experience? And I'm sort of going through this New Yorker story, reading, and Gates says, her portrayal of the field slave's living conditions demonstrates both her sense of superiority and her understanding of the dehumanizing misery of slavery. In language that is unusually potent, Crafts conjures the squalor of the huts and articulates the tensions between the house slaves and the field slaves. And at that point, the school bus came. So I had to run in, I had to get the kids, and I ran inside, but I also figured, I'm guessing this is also going to be taken from Bleak House. So Gates is quoting this passage. Is it a stretch of imagination to say that by night they contains a swarm of mystery, that crowds of foul existence crawled in and out of gaps in walls and boards, or coiled themselves to sleep on nauseous heaps of straw fetid with human perspiration, and where the rain drips in and the damp airs of midnight fetch and carry malignant fevers, which is in fact a really passionate and poignant and detailed description of slave huts. It goes on, if the slave huts were bad, the inhabitants were worse. Degradation, neglect, ill treatment had wrought on them its illegitimate effects. So I got out my copy of Bleak House, and indeed, I turned to the pages where Charles Dickens is describing London slums. And again, I have these side by side. Now these tumbling tenements contain swarms of misery, ruined human wretch, parasites appear, etc. You could read them side by side. And I kept thinking, I was looking at this and I'm thinking, well, this is really, really interesting. There is no other writer in the American experience which so deliberately compares the experience of slavery and the experience of London slums as famously described by Charles Dickens. And going through, I looked through, let me stop here. I used to work at the New Yorker. So I was interested, I finished the article and let me go back here. And I wondered where in this article would Gates would talk about the fact that Hannah Crafts was borrowing passages from Charles Dickens. And I went through and I read it and I read it again, and he doesn't. And nobody at the New Yorker does it. And I thought, well, that's kind of a problem. Somebody in the fact-checking, the famous fact-checking department of the New Yorker ought to have noticed this. So I called up some friends, because I had worked there 20 years before, and finally got a hold of somebody. And I said, look, these quotes that you're using as examples of her beautiful writing are very rough. I wouldn't call it plagiarism, but borrowings from Charles Dickens. And I think your New Yorker readers should probably know this. And about 10 minutes later, I was on the phone with Henry Louis Gates, and that's how we began to work together. He said, I sent the copy of this manuscript around to all the best American and African-American scholars in the country, and nobody caught this. I really want to start working with you because you saw something. So he said he overnighted me the entire manuscript, and he said, can you just go through it and see what you see. When I'm publishing this book, I've got 2 blank pages toward the back. They're yours. They're yours to fill with whatever you find. So I did, and one of the things I found was that Hannah Crafts was also borrowing from Jane Eyre. There's a famous scene where Jane Eyre is reading behind a curtain, and I saw that Hannah Crafts had done that too. Next morning, I descended to the parlor and seated myself with a book behind heavy damask curtains that shaded the windows. I thought, well, that's interesting. Here's this slave writer, this enslaved woman who's reading Jane Eyre. And then I, kept reading through and also noticed that she had been reading her Walter Scott. And this is really a phenomenal, if anyone is interested or had some experience in African-American literature, to have a woman in the mid-1850s writing a slave narrative that she's borrowing from and including large passages from Dickens, from Scott, from Eyre. This is amazing. So, I ended up getting a little bit famous for about a week there, where after Henry Louis Gates started talking about the fact that this incredible novel that he had found and republished had actually been full of borrowings from all these great books, it was a different kind of story. And so I was getting some calls from some reporters saying, well, this is really interesting. This is a new kind of scholarship. And so Skip asked me, Henry Louis Gates goes by Skip, Skip asked me to help research this question of who is Hannah Crafts and how can we figure out who she was. She claimed to be an African-American woman. She claimed to have been a slave and freed, but she appeared nowhere in any census, nowhere in any data. She was a complete mystery. And so there could be a case to be made that she wasn't Black at all, that she was somebody who was having a lark, who was trying to make a joke of writing this narrative, because what Skip had found was a handwritten copy. It was never published. What we do know from her manuscript was that she was owned by a man named John Hill Wheeler. So her master, as she talks about in the book, was a historian and lawyer named John Hill Wheeler. And she identifies certain things about her life in her book, but other things she leaves blank. So we went through, and historians and researchers went through everybody in his family to find out if there was any Hannah. We couldn't find anybody. What was interesting is that, like most families in the 19th century that had somebody who collected a lot of books, when they were passing or upon their passing, the books went up to auction. So there was a book that had been printed with every book that John Hill Wheeler owned. And so we were able to find this book that included every single book that he owned. So presumably, the books that she had borrowed would have been in his library. And in fact, all the texts that Hannah Crafts quotes are in John Hill Wheeler's library. So Frederick Douglass's narrative, Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, which she quotes, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Walter Scott's Rob Roy, Dickens' Old Curiosity Shop, William Worth's Life of Patrick Henry, a couple of Shakespeare, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra. So every book that she quotes was in his library except Bleak House. So I spent about a year investigating this, which is to say, how is it that she did not know? How did she come across Bleak House? Where did she read this? And I was down in the basement of the library trying to figure out where she would have read, and I was putting everything into the database. And this was in 2002, 2003. So even though Google was up and running, most of the stuff we were still doing was on microfiche. And I found out that Frederick Douglass's paper in 1850, I guess this was 50, this is a later paper I've got a picture of here, in the 1850s, serialized Bleak House. So for a year and a half, he spent the last page of his newspaper serializing Bleak House, basically stealing it because he didn't pay copyright on it. And nobody who was a Douglas scholar ever had written about this. And I thought, well, that was interesting. And this has to do with the ways that African-American scholarship structures itself. Most people who are African-American scholars read primarily African-American works, and anybody who studied Frederick Douglass didn't really care that there was a Dickens novel on the last page of it. But I went back and I read all of these, read all of the Douglass's paper, and what would happen, what was interesting is a lot of, first of all, it was interesting that the two sort of looked and dressed alike for a while there, that readers of Frederick Douglass's paper, who were primarily free blacks and abolitionists, would write into Frederick Douglass and say, why are you spending all this time on your newspaper on Charles Dickens? What's the problem with that? And he, in 1853, Douglass decided to answer these critics by saying, Charles Dickens has ever been a faithful friend to the poor. God bless him for that. And in the portraitures that he, ever and anon, weaves into his books of fiction, we see the touch of a master hand. His delineations are true to the life, and his being able to give them evinces his being intimately acquainted with the dense ignorance, squalid mystery, and pressing wants of the London poor. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because clearly, or evidently, or in my theory, Hannah Crafts probably read this in Frederick Douglass's paper and also saw and had Frederick Douglass be able to say, look, he's a good model for writing about squalor and writing about misery. So in thinking, though, about who could have written this, because there was nothing there was just nothing. We couldn't find her. She was a complete mystery. And I started thinking about genealogy, because I started thinking about, there's a passage in the book where John Hill Wheeler's John Hill Wheeler's wife is made to put on a powder on her face that turns her black. And she's about to go out to call on some senators in Washington to try to find her husband a job. She puts all the powder on the face. She goes out, and by the time she comes back, she's blackface. And it's a scandal in the book because it suggests that John Hill Wheeler was married to a black woman who went out in public and called herself Mrs. John Hill Wheeler. And it's just this very weird moment in the book. And I thought, well, it's interesting, when you think about when somebody tries to make somebody look bad, a real life figure in a book, it's usually somebody's got a beef with them. So I wondered, okay, who would have a beef with John Hill Wheeler's wife? Well, what I found was that John Hill Wheeler's wife in this book was his second wife. And there was a first wife who died and had two daughters. And I also found that the new Mrs. John Hill Wheeler was just not a nice lady. Let's just put her that way. There are names you could call her. And that she was the daughter of Thomas Sully, who was a famous portraitist in the 1840s. So I decided to go look at the Wheeler family tree. So we see John Wheeler at the very top there. And he had two sons, John Hill Wheeler and Samuel Jordan Wheeler. And John Hill Wheeler, who was the master, at least in the book, wasn't really a plantation owner. That was Samuel Jordan Wheeler, who took care of the various family estates. John Hill Wheeler's first wife, Mary Elizabeth Brown, had died in 1836, and then he married Ellen Sully Wheeler. And the daughter, Elizabeth Brown Wheeler, was obviously, what I wondered about her is, did she really like or did she not like her new stepmother? And I found that her papers were in East Carolina University. So I called up a scholar at East Carolina University. I said, look, you don't know me, I don't know you, but the papers of a woman named Elizabeth Brown Wheeler and a Mary Elizabeth Brown and also Kate Wheeler, who you see on the other side of the family tree there, are in the special collections at East Carolina University. So there's letters, there's documents, there's school things. Could you just go look at them, see what you find? His name was Greg Hekimovich, and he was a Victorianist as well, as I was at the time. And he said, sure, I'll go take a look. And I just sort of forgot about it. A couple of years, I did find this. I did find in the obituary of John Hill Wheeler's first wife that she was really, really literary, right? So in her obituary talks about how painting and music, she attained to superior excellence. Her Bible is filled with notes and reflections, that she was a thoughtful literary person. So I began to think in the back of my mind, you know, maybe this wasn't a slave who wrote this book. Maybe the first wife's daughter and some friends who were white wrote this book, which would be something that would be a little bit embarrassing, I should say, to Henry Louis Gates. But, you know, the truth is the truth. So I thought, well, I'm just going to continue to work on this. Kate and Julia Cooper, who were cousins, who were good friends, were also very, very literary. And so every now and again, while I went on to work on other projects with Skip, we published a version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, an annotated version. We did some other work together. But in the background, Greg Hekimovich, just kept digging in this archive. And he would send me some things. He would send some things that these two girls, who were the cousins, wrote under a pseudonym. Columbine wrote some things about the Civil War. So then we started thinking, God, I wonder if they wrote this. They wrote this book. And John Wheeler, who was another cousin who had died early, was also an extraordinary literary young man, but also had a photographic and an oral memory. So he could read something and then write it down by memory. This piece of paper that is next to him here in this photograph is he had gone to hear an abolitionist speech and come home and written the entire thing down word for word. That's the kind of memory he had. So when Greg called me up with this, I thought, you know, he's abolitionist. He has a memory that he can remember things, because when you look like all through the novel Handcrafts, the way she borrows the Bondwoman's narrative, it's like she knows it so well, she's integrating it into her own story. I thought, well, this is the kind of guy that would have the ability to do that. And then he died in 1861, and he also wrote under a pseudonym, Hertford. His talents were of high order, and he wrote with remarkable fluency and time brilliancy for one of his year. His letters from Washington to this paper were extensively copied and frequently received inquiries asking their authorship. So there are all these literary people in the family of John Hill Wheeler who couldn't stand the second wife and seemed to have means, motive, and opportunity to pen this slave narrative almost with the sole purpose of making her look bad. So I didn't really tell Skip this, but it was kind of my theory in the back of my head. And when Skip and I had published a book in 2003 called In Search of Hannah Crafts, and had all these incredible scholars write about what their theories of who she was and the importance of this novel, I wrote on the last page of our introduction that a scholar named Greg Hekimovich was looking at the John Hill Wheeler family correspondence for clues that may lead to her identification. So this was 2003. So I sort of forgot all about it. So getting back to the Wheeler family tree, Greg called me and he said, you know, I got some news. I said, what? He said, well, if you look over at the Samuel Jordan Wheeler side of the family, there's another cousins. He was married to a woman named Bond, and there's a grandfather named Lewis Bond. And there was an enslaved woman that worked for Lewis Bond, and her name was Hannah, and her name was Hannah Bond. And this was the Wheeler house where Lewis Bond was a neighbor of this house where Samuel Jordan Wheeler lived. And at one point in time, it was unclear when, they had decided to take in boarders from the Wesleyan Female Academy, which was right down the road. These were all these women who came to study. This was in 1854, but this was probably about 5 years earlier, 1849. And these women would come, it's kind of a high school, but a female academy, and they would stay at the Wheeler house. And at the time, because of some various, money going back and forth and some debts, Hannah Bond had moved from Lewis Bond to Samuel Jordan Wheeler. Now, Lewis Bond had taught all of the, lived with him, all of the enslaved individuals, how to read and write. And she knew how to read and write, and she helped with a lot of correspondence. So at the time, what Greg had found was at the time, she was working at the Wheeler house and also was helping these school girls who boarded at the Wheeler house with their homework. And one of the things they had to do was recitation, memorizing long passages of books. And so what were the passages of books that they were reading was Bleak House and Jane Eyre. So these girls would come back, and one of the more famous passages that he found in the records of the Academy was the opening of Bleak House, or one of the introducing a young woman named Esther Summerson. I have a great deal of difficulty in beginning to write my portion of these pages, so I'm not clever. I always knew that. I can remember when I was a little girl. Indeed, I used to say to my Dolly when we were alone together, "Now, Dolly, I'm not clever. You know that very well." And here, when we look at the Bondwoman's narrative, we see that here. It may be that I assume too much responsibility in attempting to write these pages. The world will probably say so. I'm aware of my deficiencies. I'm really neither clever nor learned nor talented. And we get a different picture here of the possible author, which it turns out is this woman, Hannah Bond, who did not read Charles Dickens in Frederick Douglass's newspaper, as I had always thought, but actually heard it being recited by these schoolgirls at the Wesleyan Female Academy while she was working for Samuel Jordan Wheeler. Now, what had happened was Samuel Jordan Wheeler had gotten into debt to his brother, John Hill Wheeler. And John Hill Wheeler and Ellen Sully Wheeler had to go to Washington for something or other, and said, well, instead of paying the debt, why don't we just take one of your slaves? Why don't we just take that one, Hannah Bond? And so they basically took her to Washington with her. That's a picture, by the way, of me, Skip, and Greg Hegemovich, who was the one who discovered this. I didn't mean to go there so quickly. And what he had found was, through looking more of what Greg had found and looking at more of these papers, that Hannah Bond, when we started the search from Washington, she had angered Mrs. Wheeler, this one, Ellen Sully Wheeler, one last time, and in the book talks about being threatened to send back south, and she took that opportunity to escape north. She just fled in the middle of the night, and made her way north. He found through some other letters that she had found her way to a family named Crafts in upstate New York, and virtue of being saved by them, changed her name to Hannah Crafts. Finally found her way to New Jersey, where she wrote all this down, and she wrote it all down by memory, the entire story, including rewriting Bleak House to fit her narrative. Anyway, this is how it got on the front page after all these years, he got on the front page when he finally figured out who it was, on the front page of the New York Times, saying he's finally figured out this. And Skip called me and he says, "Who's this Greg Hekimovich? You know, who is this guy?" So it really turns out that she's enslaved. And I was right after all. I said, yeah, Skip. And if you go to our book and if you turn to the last page of our introduction, you'll see, I wrote it there, that I think that this guy is going to actually find it. And he was really pleased. So the three of us have done a number of talks together where Greg, who's really this extraordinary scholar, has shown that just looking at the history, looking at ownership records, and going through and figuring out how, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning here, from all the various ways that we can understand a novel, both through who wrote it, who the writer of the novel was reading, in this case, the library that the writer had access to, and the writers that she overheard can get together and create this incredible piece of work. And I would urge you to go and read it. Thank you.
Oakmont Sunday Symposium and giving such a wonderful, interesting presentation. Next, well, on Sunday, April 26th, you can participate in a live Zoom question and answer session with Dr. Robbins at 11 a.m. Information can be found at oakmontsundaysymposium.org on how you can connect with the group. If you just want to send a question for Dr. Robbins, email it to osscomments@gmail.com, and she will respond on Sunday. Next week's presentation is still up in the air, so stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.